In December of 1996, in a freezing, run-down apartment on the borders of Detroit's 8 Mile, a 24-year-old man lay on a dirty mattress. He was holding a handful of pills. He was a high school dropout. He had been fired from his low-paying kitchen job. His debut rap album had sold less than 100 copies. And that very morning, he and his girlfriend had been evicted from their home. They had no money, no place to go, and his newborn daughter's diaper bag was completely empty. To the world, he was a nobody. A failure who had chased a black man's dream in a white man's body, only to be laughed out of every club in Detroit. Feeling the crushing weight of his uselessness, he swallowed the pills. He closed his eyes, expecting never to wake up. But he did wake up. And when his eyes opened in that hospital bed, something in Marshall Mathers had changed. The desperate, insecure kid who wanted everyone to like him was gone. He realized that when you have lost everything, you finally have nothing left to fear. Marshall Mathers had to die so that a monster could be born. Today, we know him as Eminem, the rap god, the fastest-selling solo artist in music history. But behind the 220 million records sold lies a story of pain, rejection, and a silent grind that would have broken any other human being. Long before the world knew his name, Marshall Bruce Mathers III was a ghost. His father abandoned him when he was just 6 months old, leaving him with a mother, Debbie, who was trapped in her own severe struggles with mental health and prescription drug addiction. They lived a nomadic, chaotic existence. Marshall never knew what it felt like to have a permanent home. They moved constantly between Missouri and Detroit, switching schools every 2 to 3 months. Imagine being the perpetual new kid. In every schoolyard, Marshall was the easy target. He was quiet, artistic, and small for his age. In the winter of 1982, the bullying turned deadly. A fellow student cornered Marshall in the school bathroom, beating him so brutally that his brain swelled. Marshall fell into a coma. For 9 days, his mother sat by his hospital bed, not knowing if her son would ever wake up, or if he would be permanently brain damaged. He survived, but the trauma ran deep. He became painfully introverted. His only escape was drawing comic books and listening to his Uncle Ronnie's cassette tapes. Ronnie was the only real father figure Marshall ever had. He was the one who introduced Marshall to hip-hop. But even that sanctuary was ripped away. In 1991, Ronnie committed suicide. Marshall was devastated. He locked himself in his room for days, listening to the tapes Ronnie had given him. He realized that the world was a cruel, uncaring place. And if he wanted to survive, he needed a weapon. That weapon was words. By the age of 23, Marshall had dropped out of high school after failing the 9th grade 3 times. He had no qualifications. But he had a dream, and he had a new responsibility. In December of 1995, his high school sweetheart, Kim, gave birth to their daughter, Haley. Marshall was determined to be the father he never had. But determination doesn't pay the rent. Marshall took a job as a short-order cook and dishwasher at Gilbert's Lodge, a local family restaurant. He worked 60 hours a week, sweating over a hot grill for a measly $5.50 an hour. During his breaks, while other workers rested, Marshall would sit on milk crates in the back alley, desperately scribbling rhymes on grease-stained napkins. He poured every single cent he saved into studio time, recording his debut album, Infinite. He believed this was his ticket out. He believed that if people just heard his lyricism, they would understand his genius. In late 1996, Infinite was released. Marshall loaded the cassette tapes into the trunk of his rusted car and drove around Detroit, trying to sell them for $5 each. The response was utter silence. The local hip-hop scene, which was heavily segregated and fiercely protective, rejected him entirely. Local DJs threw his cassette in the trash right in front of him. They told him he was a white boy, to go do rock and roll, and that he didn't belong. The album sold less than 70 copies. The dream was dead and reality was waiting. Days after the album flopped, Marshall arrived home to find his belongings piled on the street. They had been evicted. He had no money for food. He couldn't even afford to buy formula or diapers for his 1-year-old daughter. He had to watch his child cry from hunger while he stood completely helpless. He felt like an absolute failure as a man, as a father, and as an artist. The crushing depression that had been chasing him his entire life finally caught up. That was the night he took the pills. That was the night Marshall decided the world would be better off without him. But the overdose didn't kill him. He woke up in a cold sweat. And in that moment of survival, something miraculous happened. The absolute worst had already occurred. He had hit the very bottom of the well. And when you are already at the bottom, there is no longer any fear of falling. He didn't care about being polite anymore. He didn't care if people thought he was too white, too weird, or too angry. He realized that Marshall Mathers was too weak to survive this world. He needed someone else. Someone who didn't care about consequences. Shortly after his recovery, Marshall walked into a bathroom, picked up a bottle of bleach, and poured it over his hair. He looked into the mirror and saw a stranger staring back. He called this stranger Slim Shady. Slim Shady wasn't a character Marshall made up to be trendy. It was his raw, unedited, psychotic coping mechanism. Shady was the voice of every dark, angry, and frustrated thought Marshall had ever suppressed while working for $5 an hour. Through Shady, he could scream at his mother, mock his bullies, and joke about the absolute horror of his life. He recorded the Slim Shady EP. It was vicious, offensive, cartoonish, and brilliantly written. It was the sound of a desperate man with a blade at his throat, fighting his way out of a corner. But he still needed an audience, and he had one final card to play. In 1997, Marshall traveled to Los Angeles for the Rap Olympics. He had used his absolute last dollar to buy a plane ticket. The stakes were terrifying. If he didn't win the cash prize at this competition, he would be completely stranded in LA, homeless, with no way to get back to his daughter. He battled his way through the brackets, destroying opponent after opponent with unmatched venom. He reached the finals. But in a split decision, the judges awarded the victory to his opponent. Marshall lost. He walked off the stage, sat in the locker room, and put his head in his hands. He had failed again. He had no money, no hope, and no future. But while Marshall was crying in the locker room, a kid named Dean Geislinger, an intern for Interscope Records, was standing in the crowd. He had been mesmerized by the white kid with the bleached hair. Dean approached Marshall and asked for a tape. Marshall handed him a copy of the Slim Shady EP, not expecting anything to come of it. Dean took that tape and put it on the desk of Interscope's CEO, Jimmy Iovine. A few days later, Jimmy played the tape for a legendary producer who was looking for something fresh. His name was Dr. Dre. Dre listened to the first few seconds of Marshall's voice and stood up. He said that in his entire life in the music industry, he had never found anything from a demo tape, but when Jimmy played this, he wanted to find him immediately. Some executives warned Dre not to sign him, saying he was a white kid and it would ruin his reputation. Dre's response was legendary. He said he didn't care if he was purple, if he can rap like that, he wanted him. In 1999, the Slim Shady LP was released. It went quadruple platinum. Suddenly, the short-order cook who couldn't afford diapers was a multi-millionaire. The boy who was beaten into a coma was now commanding the attention of the entire world. Marshall Mathers had finally built his empire. But he never forgot the grind. He never forgot the cold trailer steps, the smell of grease at Gilbert's Lodge, or the feeling of those pills in his hand. His pain became his fuel, and his survival became our inspiration. Behind every famous name is a story you've never heard. The rejections. The rock-bottom moments. The grind that nobody saw. Marshall Mathers had to die so that Eminem could live. But in the end, he proved that no matter how deep your rock bottom is, it is merely the foundation upon which you can build your greatest triumph. If you want the truth behind the fame, you're in the right place. Subscribe to XICLUSIF.